Thank you all for coming and thank our guests for coming from Qualcomm. We are very glad to invite back our alums from Qualcomm. It's very unusual to find three executives of a company from one school. So welcome back to Van Munching Hall. And we are very glad to reconnect in some sense. There's a wealth of knowledge that you're going to bring, and I'm sure our students are going to really enjoy listening to that. Before we go further, let me first introduce Akash Palkiwala. I can pronounce the names very well. So, Akash is a graduate of our MBA program, and he's now the Chief Financial Officer for Qualcomm. Those of you who are not very familiar with Qualcomm, which you have to be. The wireless revolution, in some sense, the 5G rests on Qualcomm. It's just unbelievable company. I was just telling, as teaching tech strategy, Qualcomm used to be one of my favorite examples. Then we have Mr. Devedi. He is the Senior Director, Investor Relations. He's also a graduate of our MBA program. And then Nate, he is the Vice President of Global Affairs. I know you have a much longer title. Also a graduate of the MBA program. So welcome back. Thank you so much. So let me, since we have 60 minutes and they are to catch a flight very quickly, I'm going to get back into the questions. First of all, congrats on a great quarter. I observed it. It was a fantastic quarter, I suppose. Okay. Now, you graduated 20 years ago. At one time, the students that we see today here were like you 20 years ago. So what does your journey look like looking behind? And how well did your MBA prepare you for this very complex job in a very difficult environment? Akash, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a lot. So my story is maybe very similar to a lot of people in the room. Grew up in India, did engineering, figured out I wasn't good enough to be an engineer. So I came here for my MBA, and it was a way to, I guess the MBA word now is pivot away from engineering and go on the business side. And honestly, for me, it's like a different country. I've never been outside India. You're trying to learn the customs, the tradition, the language, because I couldn't speak Southern English or understand it, and that was my first professor in a Southern drawl. But then also really trying to understand the business environment and what we could learn out of it. And the school was really foundational in getting me past all of those things and getting me comfortable, understanding the business environment, and it set the tone for what was about to happen. Now, I'll fully admit that I graduated with a very naive plan of what I wanted to do. And what I learned through my career is that you can't plan this stuff. You have to pick things that you enjoy, do it with a lot of passion, and do it with a lot of commitment. And once you've done it for 3 years, go and pick something else. And somehow, in the end, all of these dots will connect and you'll end up in a good place and have fun doing it. So the school prepared me for all of this. I'll just maybe finish with a funny story that when I became CFO, the first thing, you sit down with lawyers and they tell you if you do these things, you can go to jail. And if you do these things, you can go to jail. And I just thought back to the ethics class here, where we were taken to a white-collar prison and we met with someone who had made mistakes and told us about things you should not be doing. And I didn't think it would become so personal and relevant to me after all these years. And so that was definitely something that stood out. And I always joke that I wore orange and stood in front of the mirror and I was not looking good. So I'm being careful.
Yes,
All right. So I guess in many ways my journey, and Akash and I were classmates for the record, and we were also apartment mates for a year, and the memories, kept us apart for about 20 years, and that's how long it took us. Eventually we ended up working together at the same company. But the other point I'll add to what Akash said is I think the context that you get from interacting with a highly diverse group of individuals and so the person-to-person interaction in a business program is something that cannot be replicated by almost any other sort of stream of education, if you will, right? So for me, that was sort of the eye-opening thing is this is how different people think, this is how they interact. You try this and you're working in small groups, for 5 or 6 people, you learn how to express yourself so that others will be more accepting of your viewpoint, as opposed to say trying to bludgeon your way through or never speaking up and sort of learning that right balance, right? So those interpersonal interactions were I think super important in terms of what we got out of the education. And like Akash said, you can't plan your journey. You just have to take the next step forward and say, hey, what did I learn, over this period of time? How can I best maximize it? And then life will happen and your priorities will change. But the skill set that you take away from the business school, will always be of help. I mean, a simple example is, and we were chatting about this on the way in. I apologize for not remembering the name of the professor, but we had a communications professor who would walk into every class in our first year here, and she would say, she was teaching us marketing communications, and she'd say, what's your bit from? And she said this on day 1, and I didn't understand, what is she talking about? And she goes, what's in it for me? Every time you present to an audience, before you craft your message, you have to figure out why is it that they will listen to you. And she would say it and say it and say it until it was drilled into your head. And that never left me, right? So I still remember 22 years later sitting here. I'm now doing a job where whether I'm successful or not depends entirely on whether I can craft that message, because I'm doing investor relations, right? So I'm trying to explain what the company is doing to folks who own billions of dollars of a stock. But if I didn't have that in the back of my head, I would say things in a way that made sense to me, but would be completely irrelevant to them, right? So I think life sort of lessons, if you will, you would not be able to sit here today and predict what part of your learning is it that you're going to maximize, walking out of here. But I guarantee you're learning a lot of stuff and absorbing it, and at the right time, it will all manifest itself as you start the journey. So stop there.
Good advice for what I do too. So my perspective is a little bit different. I live here in Washington, D.C. And after graduating from the Smith School, I worked for a very small niche political consulting firm. But I've also worked for large corporations and helped start think tanks and worked for government and worked for public affairs firms, and where Qualcomm was my client, and eventually ended up at Qualcomm. And I've had global government affairs. I'm coming up on my 8th year anniversary at Qualcomm, which is kind of amazing. My message to you guys is, it doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter where you think you want to end up, but you have to do the best job possible picking opportunities that are meaningful for you, and where you think there are opportunities for you to make an impact, to learn something, to have some fun, to work with smart people. And I think you learn a lot of that in business school. And particularly if you're going to stay in the Washington, D.C. area, something you should know about being an MBA is MBAs are sort of imbued with magic in our nation's capital. There are a lot of lawyers in Washington, D.C., I'm married to one, who don't want to be lawyers and who are doing other things. In fact, there are so many of them, they are relatively, you can discount them because there's so many of them. There are very few MBAs. And so you stand out like you have some magical knowledge, which you may or may not have. But you have an understanding of the business world and business environment that a lot of people don't, and that will separate you. You have training in management, which people sorely lack here in our nation's capital. And so you've got to use those things that are your edge to help you get ahead in whatever that job is. And I think the MBA prepares you really, really well for that. I'm very pro MBA.
So I'm going to ask a few more questions and I'll let the audience ask. So you always talk about leadership. Leadership is big. So if you don't mind, if you can share 3 qualities, hopefully non-overlapping qualities, that you find is very important for your success.
I think picking the best team is an important part of leadership. I have an incredible team and I do much better than I should be doing because people around me are awesome. And so I think maybe that's the first one. Second is when things get difficult, you have to put your hand up. A leader cannot hide when things are hard. And it's the most uncomfortable time to put your hand up, but that's the time when you have to do it. And then maybe the third thing I'll say is just if you don't work hard, your team won't. And so you have to be this outstanding example of someone who goes above and beyond. And then the team will follow you. Maybe those are the 3 things that come to mind for me.
So I'll try to add on a couple to that. I don't know if I can think of 3 off the top of my head, but I think clarity of communication, right? So we sort of take it for granted. But the more senior your role at the company, the more that's of importance, right? So if you can't set targets clearly, people don't know what you really want. If they're second guessing, what is it that you want out of a meeting or a presentation, out of a strategic project that you started, you won't get the endpoint, right? So setting very clear goals and very clear terms, which by the way, Akash does an amazing job of, is super important. And I think the other thing is the willingness to admit mistakes in public. So I was an investor for 20 years before I came to Qualcomm, and now I'm doing investor relations. I probably interacted with 200, I'm making up a number, public companies over that period of time across different industries, across different verticals. It was very rare to find business leaders that I could sit on a conversation with and say, I was sitting with you a year ago. You said the following. It turns out that you were flat out wrong. What happened, right? If that question ever got asked, the response would always be, well, but let me explain how it's really right. But in 5% of the cases, the answer would be, I was just dead wrong. And we moved on, and this is what we've done to change things around here, right? Even at the CEO, CFO level of Fortune 500 companies, that is an extremely rare attribute. I'm glad I see a lot of people like that at Qualcomm. But again, I would say that sort of stands out in terms of why one leader is better than the other.
It's always best to go last on a panel. I would say humility. No one's as smart as they think they are. And make sure that, if you're the smartest person in the room, find another room. Empathy, because it's hard to know what other people are going through. And you have to make sure that in a team environment, you understand people's relative strengths and weaknesses, kind of what Akash was talking about, to get the best out of it. And a keen attribute is intellectual curiosity. I want people on my team who are always learning, more importantly, who are always making me learn and stretching me as a leader. I think that's super important. Those are
Great point. So let me switch gear and ask a little bit more technical in some sense. You're in high tech. The geopolitical tensions are intensifying. It's a global competition. Within the US, there's a lot of regulatory environment coming in. More controls on standards. You can't exploit your standards so easily. If you make too much money, they are coming after you saying you're not paying taxes, you're doing that. How do you get prepared for this kind of challenge that is coming from all directions today? I think it's a common for all high-tech companies today.
I'll definitely defer to our government affairs lead for that.
I'll start, and you guys should add. It's incredibly risky time right now. And we were having a conversation with members of your finance club earlier. There's more concentrated risk in the island of Taiwan than almost any other place in the world right now, with the exception of the border between Russia and Ukraine. And the border between Russia and Ukraine matters. But the real impact is on the island of Taiwan. Most technology companies' supply chains run through Taiwan at some point. And ours definitely do, because we're a fabless chip company. So we don't manufacture our own semiconductors. They're manufactured for us by TSMC in Taiwan, by Samsung in Korea and Austin, Texas, by Global Foundries in New York, and did you say Malta earlier? I didn't know Malta, and I think Singapore, and a couple other places around the world. But there's so much concentrated risk in Taiwan that our job at Qualcomm is to make sure that we are diversifying our risk as much as possible, both in terms of product concentration, our customer concentration, and our supply chain. It's a huge issue for us. Akash, what do you think?
It was Malta, New York, not the Malta you like to visit. On this topic, I'll tell a story about something that ties this topic to the previous question about leadership. So a few years ago, Qualcomm was in the middle of several things going on at the same time. From a regulatory perspective, we had an activist investor, someone was trying to buy the company, several things going on at the same time. And that was when Steve Mollenkopf, our CEO, put up his hand and said, I want 98% of the company to work on the products and the customers. Don't worry about all these problems we're going to deal with. I'm going to leave the 2% and work on those. And a lot of the regulatory problems and a lot of the government problems, all those problems are the 2% problem. And one of the great leadership lessons I learned is how he was able to focus 98% away from the noise on the products, because in the end, that's all that matters, right? Like everything else just adds more noise to the system. And him and a few other folks focused on solving the biggest problems in front of the company that were very, very significant. I know Nate was a part of the 2%, so I'm sure he has insight into it.
We kind of rebranded internally from being government affairs and formed a smaller team called the Existential Crisis Division. And because we were under attack from regulators in China and Korea and Taiwan and Europe and the United States. We were being sued by our largest customer, and we were being pursued in a hostile takeover by one of our biggest competitors. So it was a pretty rough time, but Steve Mollenkopf, our former CEO, gave a very important lesson, and probably the most important thing he ever told me for my career, which is I had my job interview with him the day after he had been named CEO. And I kind of looked at him and I said, don't you have something better to do right now than to interview me? You're about to be the CEO. He said, not really. And I said, what's going to change for you when you become CEO? And he said, I really have to focus, like what Akash said. And he said, I'm going to do the things that only I can do. And that has really stuck with me in leading a large global team, that I've got to trust people to do their jobs. I've got to, give them authority, hold them responsible, but let them do the work. And I'm going to do the things that only I can do, because Steve was going to do the things that only he could do. And I think that's one of the ways we helped get through this crisis, was by really focusing every single day.
So it was noise. No, this is great. I think I'm a stock market junkie. Not now so much, but I always observe, because how the market reacts and how the CEOs and CFOs now interact with these very difficult questions. Those of you who heard the Senate hearing, when they were grilling the CFO and the CEO, they asked, what are you doing to make this, or to make profits out of it? And I'm saying, what do firms exist for? Right? Of course, you're doing it to make profits. But now it is becoming very hard in a political environment that is actually challenging that you make money. And especially when you have standards. So how did the MBA prepare you for these things? Or is it something the MBA cannot prepare you for these things? How do you, so because right now, those who hold standards, those who hold platforms are having a tough time to compete in the market.
Yeah, I don't think of business school as preparing you for tangible things. It gives you tools that are intangible, and then you apply it to situations and you learn on the job. And it's not what you read in the book. It's the soft stuff that you're going to learn here that's what matters. There's this famous sine curve of math that you do in your life. And it gets more and more difficult as you go through education. And then once you start working, you're doing arithmetic and that's it. And I think it's just like that, right? Learn the intangibles and then be curious. A lot of people they lose the opportunity to keep learning. And I think with the way the world is evolving, being able to constantly learn is way more important than what you've actually learned in the past. And so can you be this curious living organism that is always learning every single day and becoming better? And if you can do that, and whether it's regulatory problems or antitrust problems or any other kind of problems, if you can do that, then maybe you're ready to deal with it. By the way, it's not a secret, but when you become a CEO or you become a CFO, you're actually not ready for what you're going to deal with. You learn it when and how things happen, and then how you react in that moment of stress and that moment of intense focus on you is what defines your performance. Just because you got that role doesn't mean you know how to react in tough situations.
I'll just add one additional thought to that, which is, so I'd always been an investor, like I said before I came here, and now that I'm a Cycle firm, one of the big learnings for me over the last year has been, there is no topic under the sun that I can think of or I've come across yet in my 1 year here, for which a highly sophisticated expert does not exist within Qualcomm. So all I have to do is to find them. Right? So this sort of goes back to what the dean was asking, which is the way the MBA helps you, or the way your interactions help you, is if I can learn to make relationships, if I can learn to reach out, if I can be humble enough and say, hey, I really need your help on this, and how can I help you with what you're trying to do, then most of the problems are solved. So again, it isn't really the tangible knowledge, it's really sort of knowing how to get the work done that counts in the end.
Let me just add, probably the most important thing that I did while here at business school, preparing me for the real world, was the case competition. I hope you still do that. I don't know if you do. My team won the year we did it. Maybe that's why confirmation bias tells me. But we had a problem, a multifaceted problem to solve. And fortunately, I had a really smart finance guy on my team who helped us come up with what our solution was for, this was in the early days of Priceline. We're old, so just take that with a grain of salt. Who helped us come up with a solution for Priceline, which was flailing at the time, and maybe they're still flailing. But working in a team, solving a problem, bringing in outside experience and inputs was really critical. And I think it's what makes your career successful today. Find a couple really smart finance guys if you're not one, and make sure you work really closely with them and help guide and shape the folks who are making the decisions in your company. Help them, advise them really properly.
That's great. So let me open up questions. I have more, but if you don't have, I'll ask. But let me ask the students or anybody else want to ask questions.
So I know Akash said. Hi. So I know Akash said that he had like an engineering undergrad degree. Did everyone else as well have a different degree before pursuing an MBA, or did you do a business undergrad?
Education.
I was an engineer as well. Engineer.
Because I'm a computer science major and I've always been more interested in like administrative roles as opposed to just doing like technical like hard coding. And I think coming from like CS school, it's often like emphasized, oh, just go into like software engineering without really giving you kind of a well-rounded insight into the different like career options there are. Yeah, that's what I wanted to know.
We have an amazing software engineer who works in our government affairs office, a woman named Susie Armstrong, who helped write the code that connected a phone to the internet for the very first time. She's amazing. But she had this incredible career as first as a software engineer, as a project manager, as a customer lead for some of our biggest customers, and then pivoted into a career in her 24th year at Qualcomm into government affairs. And so, you know, she is a mentor and a role model as one of my team members, and somebody I look up to be like, you can really do anything if you put your mind to it and apply your energy in the right place. And, you know, you can't let what you learned along the way define what you might be, because as Akash said, those are just tools. Those are just tools, and what you do with them is what really matters.
So I've never met you before, I don't know you well enough, but just the way you asked that question, it makes me want to tell you that don't go and code. I mean, just the way you asked that question didn't sound like that's what you're passionate about, that's what you'd like to do. And I know it'll be difficult because that's where all the money is right now. To go pursue what you want to do, don't pick the easier option there.
I think where the question came into play is I went into CS with more of an idea of what I wanted to do in terms of like I knew I wanted to be in like tech and maybe like finance and tech and somewhere in the intersection of those two. But I haven't found that many like opportunities or people who have talked about their experiences of starting off as a CS major and then, you know, kind of switching gears and saying, okay, now this is not what I want to do. I want to use this degree and then go into like administrative roles or more business based roles. And so I just wanted to know how like the skills that you picked up in your undergrad kind of helped you make that transition. It's obviously engineering and business are two very different things. So yeah.
I'll just say one thing, which is what, and you made this point earlier that you know what's really important is at any given point of time, you try to solve for what do you think makes you happy at that instant, right? So to go back to what Akash's point was, which is you know, don't try to maximize for money. I'd be the perfect example of, you know, here's an example of, you know, don't do it. So that's what I was trying to do when I was in business school. It's like Wall Street's where all the money is. That's where I want to go. No other thought behind, you know, other than that. I mean, I did like the stock market, so a little bit of a stock market journey. But really, money was the more motivating factor. 5 years after the fact, I was, you know, thinking about, you know, I'm not really enjoying this, and like, what am I doing with my life and all of that, right? And I wish someone had sort of held my hand and said that earlier. But from an education perspective, from a learning perspective, I think the most important thing is recognize that the work environment is nothing like college, right? What gives you joy when you actually start working on a day-to-day basis wouldn't necessarily be how much you like coding or you know, anything else that you're specifically doing, but what is your day like? Like, are you surrounded by people who you really like? You know, when you go out for lunch, are you happy or not? Right? So you probably want to focus more on that and sort of, you know, what do my day look like? You know, what activities interest me? Where do I want to live? And the biggest advantage you have at your age, which people like me and Akash don't have, is, you know, I have 30, 40 years on our side. So, you know, so just recognize, I mean, you know, you can make 5 different choices over the next 5 years, and they can all be diametrically different from each other. And you could still come out, you know, with flying colors. So just like take as much risk as you want. This is the time.
Thank you.
Hey, I just have one little note to add about Susie Armstrong. I'm clearly the president of her fan club. She has a Maryland connection, which is her husband is the dean of the information school here. And the information school, plus the business school, plus engineering is like the nexus of Susie Armstrong's career. But her husband, Dean Marzullo, is here. He's a great resource, so take advantage of that while you're here too.
So I imagine that all of you guys have teams that report to you, and so I'm curious, what makes your best team members stand out?
I'll say something that I think I told in the sessions earlier. There are a couple people in my team who, every time I give them something to do, of course they nail what I asked for, but they come back with something that I didn't think about. Because they put in the effort, they broadened the question I asked them, didn't take the literal question. They went after what I was probably trying to solve and came back and surprised me with the answer. And they do it every single time I ask them to do something. And clearly when I was referring to people who are much smarter than me and make me better, it's people like that. So I think when you find people smarter than you, keep them, and especially people who understand the context of a question rather than the words of a question, and then can come back with, hey, here's the answer to the question you asked, but here are the 10 other things that you might not have thought through, and let me tell you, and here's what we need to go do. That to me is the best team member I can find. So anyways, that's my view.
Let's echo that. I mean, I've always been blessed with working on small, flat teams, so there was sort of an environment where I had 20 people reporting into me, or you know, so even now with the function that I'm in, you know, Claudia, my highly talented colleague, is sitting right here, and she and I work closely together in investor relations. And again, it's a very small, flat team. You know, we just interact with each other all the time. There is no formal hierarchy. That's how it was on the investment side as well when I was interacting. So it's less about the reporting structure. I think it's more about the value you bring to the table is entirely dependent on the questions you are willing to ask. And that applies whether, you know, this is your interaction with someone at your level or below your level or above your level. Anytime you're given a project or anytime you are supposed to, you know, do a task given by someone else, make sure that the very first time you face that, just ask as many questions as you can. And if you forgot to ask something, go back and don't be afraid, right? The worst thing anyone can do is make assumptions, not bother to clarify them, spend all the energy doing it, and then find out 3 weeks later that, you know, it was all a wasted effort. So I would just say that, like, you know, what distinguishes people well, you know, whether they're reporting into you or you're reporting into them, is that willingness to ask a lot of questions all the time.
I totally agree with both of those, and the only thing I'll add is I really value collaboration. We don't have a tolerance for the brilliant jerk. They create as much trouble as they add value. And so I really want people who can work well in a team environment. There are no mythical cylinders of excellence, right? That's what people who think they're in one, they're really in something called a silo. And it's a terrible place to be. So you want people who can work, who can ask those hard questions, deliver you the extra value without being a jerk and doing it with some measure of humility, because nobody exists in a vacuum in a corporate environment. You're always working with other teams, whether inside your own team or with other teams. So look for diplomats.
If any of you three gentlemen could go back in time to 20 years ago when you completed your MBA, where would you have put more time and effort toward, whether that's a class or activity inside or outside of the classroom or anything else? Where would you have put more time?
Finance. I did marketing strategy, which I really liked, and was, you know, quant heavy, and I learned a ton. I took some extra finance classes at the end, totally paid off. So if you're in year one, finance makes the world go round.
I just say I was a quintessential nerd for most of my life, so I just wish I'd been socializing a lot more earlier in my life. And so that would apply even to the MBA experience that I had. I mean, the social interactions that I missed, because I was too focused on getting the right grade on the last exam, was probably, misguided effort, if you will. I mean, it's really the interaction of people that really teaches you most of what you need to know.
That's what we were doing in marketing strategy.
Yeah, I was gonna give the same answer as Sasmin. I didn't get to all the bars in college park. So I might have to come back and go to that.
Oh, would definitely love to accompany you on those. Work.
Thank you. My question is about what we were talking about earlier with the geopolitical risks. Intel just announced a multi-billion-dollar factory in, I believe, Arizona. The Biden administration has identified semiconductors as critical to national security. Are you facing pressure, not just political, to bring your supply chains closer to home? What would it take for you to do that? For example, subsidies, customer pressure, increased R&D capacity, workforce preparation, et cetera.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. It's a really great question. It's a really great question. So Intel is building they're building new fabs in Arizona, and they just announced them in Ohio. They need more money to build more. So there's a piece of legislation called the CHIPS Act, which has been passed by the Senate. A different version passed by the House this week. They're going to try to reconcile those two bills. It's really important for us. We talked about risk concentration in Taiwan, and we really need to diversify our supply chain to make sure that, whether it's a fire or an earthquake or a hostile military action in Taiwan, that we can continue to get the supplies we need to provide to our customers. So we want to make sure that we are having chips manufactured for us in Europe, in the US, and other places in Asia to help reduce that risk concentration. Super important to us. And a lot of that requires government subsidy. We don't manufacture these ourselves, but it's too expensive. It's been too expensive for a lot of companies to do it here. So we want them to do more of that here in the United States. Really good for us.
So actually, I want to follow, that was one of my questions. How do you balance that? Because a lot of companies went to China and many parts of Asia in pursuit of profits. There's no doubt about it. And we saw in the previous election that got back. So now they are coming back, including one of the most profitable companies on the earth, which is, which company it is. Even when they came to Austin, they took $30 million subsidy, the money that would have gone to schools. That's the way the companies are operating. So if they lower the taxes, would companies seek subsidies? Or even if they lower the taxes, we still need to have subsidies. Taxes do matter. Assume they lower the taxes, corporate taxes. Would companies stop asking for more subsidies? Your thoughts?
To be honest, my view on this topic is that we should make commercial business decisions that are separate from the government. I think government can help in certain cases, like the extreme situation we just discussed. But generally, I prefer that Qualcomm makes commercial decisions based on the options that are available from a technology perspective. See, we're not optimizing just for this problem. You're optimizing for cost, you're optimizing for technology, and you're optimizing for kind of geopolitical environment. And you have to make a decision that balances all three. And I think it's much easier to reduce the noise as much as possible when you're making hard decisions and make commercially correct decisions versus motivated by some subsidies or things like that. Because in the end, if that doesn't lead to the right decision, you're going to have different kind of problems later, and it doesn't solve the problem you're trying to solve.
Go ahead.
Can I follow up or?
Please go ahead.
So some people more researchers have said that automation could be a potential way to lower costs if you were to bring your supply chains back to the US. Do you guys see that as realistic? And are you guys investing in robots or conducting R&D to explore that possibility?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're working on robotics in a slightly different way. We're working on robotics just as one of the digital transformation things that are happening in the industry, right? And we have the right set of tools in terms of chips and software that allows that to happen. So we released a robotics platform, so someone can take Qualcomm chip with our software and use it to create a robot. And so a lot of what are robots, cars are robots these days. All of them use our chips, and that's the opportunity we are after. It's not coming from a place of, I want to bring things onshore, so I'm going to invest in a robotics platform. There's a trend in the industry overall, and we have the technology to help accelerate it, and that's why we invested.
Hi, this is a question for Akash. Mentioned leadership. And so my question is, to the extent that you can share, while you were working on an acquisition that seemed that was not heading towards success, what was something that you said or did, or that you saw someone say or do that sort of moved it towards the goal line?
Oh, on a specific acquisition situation. So it's interesting, we just went through this process. We're in the process for acquiring a company called Veoneer. It's a public Swedish company that, among other things, makes software for autonomous driving, for ADAS. We were trying to buy a portion of that company, and we made a bid for it, and we lost the bid. Someone else got into an agreement to acquire the company at a certain price. And it was really an asset that we wanted. We didn't want the whole company, we wanted a portion of it and wanted to avoid dealing with the other part of the company. So there's a public to public acquisition that was already announced. And our new CEO, Cristiano Amon, in his first week as CEO, decided to go in with a bid, which was like somewhat of a dangerous decision for him to take in the very first week as CEO, where there's a public to public acquisition that's already happening, and he was going to go intercept it by bidding on top of it. And if you spend time in the M&A world, very, very difficult to do. And one of the things he said during the thought process is, and we were both debating it, and I have to say I was neutral and I didn't want to go this aggressive. And he just took it down to the basic fundamental of, is this the asset we want? And I said, yeah, this is the right asset. And it's like, there's no excuse for not going for it then. And it's something that stuck with me. It was a lesson in leadership. I talked earlier about putting your hand up when you have to make very, very hard calls. And that was the example of Cristiano doing it in his first week as CEO.
Hi, I'm a telecommunication graduate student, so my question would be a little more technical than you would expect. So with the advent of 5G and 6G, we see this trend that computing is being centralized. I mean, the devices are getting not that computationally efficient because they're centralizing computing. When you see platforms like Stadia and stuff. So my question is, how would Qualcomm transform itself into something new? Like, I'd like to give the example of Facebook. They're venturing into metaverse and like transforming themselves totally. So what would be your leadership technique, or what maneuvers would you take to move Qualcomm into a totally new direction? Because we see that technology, I mean, chipsets, like it's going from 7 nanometer to 5.4. There's obviously a saturation point that it would reach. So how would Qualcomm deal with this kind of disruption is what I would like to know.
Yeah, so I think the trends you talked about are all an opportunity rather than a risk. So think about cloud connectivity is happening, computers moving to the cloud. The most cloud connected device there is the phone. And we have the strongest position in phones. So then you say, okay, now let me think about other devices that are going to get cloud connected. Car. We have all the right technology to take it to a car. We have all the right technology to take it to PC, as the PC actually becomes lightweight in terms of memory and things like that and does more on the cloud. What you need at the edge is connectivity. So we're the leaders in 5G, we're leaders in Wi-Fi. You need low power compute because most of these devices are battery powered. And then the third thing you need is you need to do some AI at the edge, because sending all the data back to the cloud to do AI is very difficult because there's so much data. So there are all three things that are excellent for Qualcomm. So I think actually the way you describe the situation plays into our hands rather than being a risk that requires a transformation of the company.
I'll just make one other observation to what Akash just said, which is, so when I was in my previous role, one of the things we'd be trying to figure out all the time is dealing with companies that are going through change. How do they deal with it? How do the successful ones come out? And the ones that sort of fall by the wayside. And one of the lessons you learn is the quicker the company is willing to adapt, and the more it is meritocracy, the higher the odds are of succeeding. So Qualcomm would be a perfect example of that, because ever since I've been with the company for the last year, I've seen decisions being made at a pace that I would not have imagined for a company this size. And we talked about a few of those in our prior session. I won't repeat those, but I think that's super important, and I think so that equips us somewhat uniquely to be able to sort of take advantage of these opportunities, or should they become risks. The other thing is, I'm trying to imagine myself in your shoes and saying, if I had asked that question of 30 different technology company CFOs, how many of them would have been able to give an answer as concise as what he just did? And the answer is actually shockingly low, right? So for the end markets that you serve, for the business that you're in, you need a management team that is extremely in the weeds and knows exactly what they're doing so that they're capable of reacting quickly, right? And that's, I think, is a unique asset that we have that a lot of other large public companies lack. So I'm somewhat of a new convert to Qualcomm, but I'm just trying to tell you what I think.
I'll give a line that Cristiano often uses. In the technology industry, if you are in a race and you still feel like you have control, you're not going fast enough. So it is an industry where you have to move very, very fast, and sometimes you'll not be in control, and that's okay.
I have an interesting question from the last week for Qualcomm. So a week ago, you released 2021 ESG reporting metrics, and it had a huge effort, focus on how governance plays a role. Each of you comes from different perspectives. How did your perspectives feed into this ESG report that you all released last week?
I'll start. My team did the report drafting, and so corporate responsibility for us sits under government affairs, but works really closely with, from an ESG perspective, with our finance team, with our facilities team, and for us, the governance component of it sort of focuses on a couple things: how we manage ourselves internally, and what our goals are internally, and what our structure is like. And without getting into too much detail, all of these decisions go up to our ESG champions, like Akash, like our head of HR, like our CEO, to make sure that the things we're trying to do from a sustainability perspective are really bought into by the top leadership of the company. And so we're really lucky to have that at Qualcomm. Of course, Larry Fink has all helped us get even more religion when BlackRock put out its letter with its ESG expectations, it sort of shook up the way a lot of companies think about this. We were already doing a lot of this stuff, so it was pretty easy for us to get that. The other piece is Qualcomm works from a macro governance perspective. So much of what we do is impacted by regulatory officials that we pay a lot of attention to the bigger governance picture, political picture, as a form of risk and opportunity for our company. So it's pretty natural for us to deal in that space. I don't know what you guys want to add.
I'll just quickly add, I mean, a lot of the focus on ESG, because it's been investor driven, over time, what you've seen is investors sort of become, the central piece, if you will, of all the focus on ESG. And so Claudia and I were both intimately involved with the drafting of the CR report and sort of, talking through the various functions and making sure we represent the investor view, which is central to the whole thing. So I think from an investor standpoint, the important thing to remember is this is all happening for very valid business reasons, right? So companies like BlackRock and other folks have sort of come to the realization that, and this is revolutionary, that the good business or ethical business or governance-led business, however you want to call it, is actually good business, because sort of technology and big tech has sort of become the poster child of you can treat your employees well, you can have very consistent social and progressive social policies. You can lean in as much as you want in whatever political direction, that's sort of not important. But all of that can create really good businesses, right? And so every other industry is sort of looking at that and saying, why can't we do what big tech is doing, right? And that's where a lot of this discussion is coming from, right? So we were just sort of trying to add that perspective into the whole process, and then hopefully some of that came through. But that's why sort of governance is so front and center. I mean, there was a time when governance was sort of defined as looking at your board and making sure the ethnic composition of the board is appropriate and diverse, right? And that was the extent of anyone's concern about governance. And now governance is all about everything that affects the enterprise. So risk, what are your cybersecurity protocols? That's part of governance, right? How would you manage political risk? That's part of governance, right? What's the reporting structure? That's part of governance, right? So thanks to all of this investor focus, I think the definition has become a lot broader. And so people are actually looking at this as a tool to decide what companies to invest in, which has really helped sort of clarify the framework and made it a lot more useful from a practical perspective.
We have a few more minutes. I'll ask one last question. So now that 5G, you have quantum computing, you have lots and lots of new technologies coming in, AI and other things. The US government is very concerned about the competition from China, and especially in 5G, you all know what happened. What's your prognosis in terms of this global competition, which is getting heated up every day between US and China and other countries? How is it going to evolve? What's your take? Without having to reveal too much, I know you're in a position where you can answer some of those things. But what's your take where this is going to head?
Well, I think the model we have in the US is actually the perfect model. I mean, we have the right sources of funding, we have the right innovation mindset, the education, the environment for entrepreneurship, the funding availability. It's all there. So we just let it do its thing, because I think you'll see innovation come through because it's organic and it's natural and not forced. So the more innovation will happen, the stronger, in my mind, the US will be, and we need to let it happen now.
The only thing I'd add on to that, that's exactly right, is that we have a strong commitment to the rule of law. If you had to choose where to patent your technology, and you had to choose between China and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and the United States and even Europe, the place you'd start is here, because it's a sort of a fundamental tenet. And that's how innovators get rewarded a lot of times, is through through a patent that protects their ideas so they can share it, but they end up getting paid for it. Qualcomm is one of the largest patent holding companies in the world. So it's really important to us. We make this technology that then we can share, that helps become part of the standard that allows your phone to work, whether you're in China or Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or France. And so having that as part of that fundamental underlying condition, I think is really important. China is actually coming a long way in this regard. They have really strengthened intellectual property rights from a place where they weren't very strong before, in part because they saw it as a way to win and replicate some of the success that we've had here. So we see that as a really important global trend, but one that we can't take our eye off here in the US.
Anyone has a last question? I think they have to rush to the airport after this, they have to catch flight. If there are no questions, let me thank Akash, Sir Smith and Nate and Claudia. Thank you for also coming, sorry to put you here. Thanks for your time and your insights, and I'm sure we're going to have you more back on campus, and we're going to expand our relationship with companies, with our alumni, and I hope you'll come back more often. And a round of applause for their time.